Hello and welcome to Dragons Plus Aliens, where we talk about classic sci-fi and fantasy, mainly books. I'm Jay and this is Simon, and today we're going to be doing the second episode of our discussion of Dune because there was so much Dune to get through. So in last month's episode, we gave an overview of the first 4 books in the 6-book Dune series, and we talked about some of the problematic elements in those books, including Frank Herbert's homophobia and the depiction of children in what I believe is an over-sexualized way. Today, we're going to cover the last 2 books in the series. So we're going to summarize Heretics of Dune and Chapterhouse Dune. We're going to talk about another problematic question around Frank Herbert, namely, are the Dune books proto-fascist? And then we are going to move away from the full series with all its deep thought and problematic elements and focus back on the way that the first book has been adapted. As we discussed in the previous video, we think there's a reason why the first book is the most adapted, and we're going to talk about the David Lynch adaptation. We're going to talk about the attempted 1970s adaptation by Jodorowsky, which would have been amazing if it had been made. Probably one of the most amazing things ever made. We're going to talk about Warhammer 40,000 and how that adapted the first book and some of the video games. So let's get into it. I think, what do you reckon, Simon? I'm just going to kick off by, let's look at the last 2 books and find out.
Yeah, I reckon, just to remind anybody watching this, that I've never read the Dune books, but I feel like I have. And so I guess the overarching thing, one of the things we're talking about, is the kind of cultural impact of these novels is so great, as I think Jay and I will argue towards the end of this episode, that in a weird way I kind of feel I don't need to read them, even though I should.
Okay, I have read them so that you don't have to. So the first 4 books, as we discussed, form a kind of arc in which we get the story of Paul Atreides, the hero of the first book, and his son Leto II, who ultimately becomes the God Emperor of Dune, rules for over 1,500 years, and then dies in his immortalish form as a giant sandworm, 7 meters long, not entire sandworm. We then move on in the last 2 books form start a separate arc. So we're 3,500 years after the events of God Emperor of Dune. As we discussed in God Emperor of Dune, one of the things that Leto II did was to control and restrict spice production so that people couldn't travel from their planets, and space travel effectively ceased. After his death, there was an event called the Scattering, in which the many civilizations of the Dune universe moved out into the universe. And as a result of the Scattering, this new antagonist has emerged. They're called the Honored Matres. They're, again, a female-only order, like the Bene Gesserit, but opposed to the Bene Gesserit. The Bene Gesserit become very much the good people in these 2 books, and much more human, and more sensitive. The Honored Madre are very bad. They use their sexual powers to enslave and dominate men. Bad, according to Frank Herbert. No one enjoys it in the books at all. So what happens in Heretics of Dune? Oh, sorry, I completely messed those up. Leto II rules for 3,500 years, and now we're 1,500 years after the death of Leto II. Apologies, any Dune heads who spotted that error. So the Scattering has taken place. It mainly focuses on a girl called Sheeana who's been discovered on Arakis. Arakis is now called Rakis. And she is a direct genetic descendant of Leto II's twin sister Ganima from Children of Dune. She has the power to control the sandworms, so the Bene Gesserit are bringing her up on Arakis, and on Gidi Prime, which was the Harkonnens' homeworld. If you remember, or if you watched our previous episode, there's a ghola, a clone of the Atreides swordmaster called Duncan Idaho, who has been brought back and back and back throughout the 3,500 year reign of Leto II as a clone again and again. He is again brought back in this book by the Tleilaxu, the race of genetic manipulators. And he's a boy in this book, a new clone. He's being brought up on Giddy Prime by the Bene Gesserit, but also by this man, an older man called Teg, who's a military leader of the Bene Gesserit, and he is also a mentat, a human computer in the Dune universe, and he is effectively the hero of this book, of these two books, really. And he's a much more human, likable hero than Leto II was. So what you really do get in this book is, whereas the previous books have been very much centered around this, the great leader in the form of Paul Atreides and Leto II, in this book you get a much more diverse cast of characters, and it does have a bit more of a conventional space opera feel and a more human feel, which is really nice. Mainly conflict with the Honored Matres. It culminates in one of the Honored Matres trying to sexually dominate the 15-year-old Duncan Idaho. There is a really egregious example of child sexual abuse in Chapterhouse Dune, which I'll come on to. This isn't it, even though he is 15, I have to point out, and a minor, so this is technically not great, but glossing over that, as you have to do with much of Frank Herbert, Duncan Idaho rises to the occasion, calls on the genetic memories of the past Duncan Idahos, and even though he's only 15, he managed to sexually dominate Bella, the Honored Madre, bending her to his masculine will. Hooray! And then they all escape on a spaceship from Arakis, which is about to be blown up by the Honored Madre, evil, Sheeana, the Duncan Idaho, ghola, Bella, now sexually dominated, and the last sandworm. They escape to Chapterhouse Dune, the home planet of the Bene Gesserit, to, we are told, form a new Arakis. So that's the fifth book. The sixth book, Chapterhouse Dune, I really have to preface, and I don't want to go on about it too much because I addressed it quite substantially in the previous email. This book contains an example of, or a scene of, the sexual abuse of a prepubescent boy, which I'm not going to describe because I find it too unpleasant and upsetting. But I just want to say I almost didn't finish this book because of it. And so I cannot really recommend this book. I'm not going to go on about it, but I will tell you what happens because I think people want to know. Teg, the hero, mentat, older guy, gets blown up at the end of Heretics of Dune. He's brought back as a child ghola, a clone, in this book. And again, the book chronicles the continued struggles of the Bene Gesserit against the Honored Matre, the evil Bene Gesserit, who try to sexually enslave men. There's quite a lot more sexual content than there is in previous books, descriptions of sex, which aren't great. If you're looking for spice, if you're looking for spice, come to this book. But if you're looking for spice in the conventional, in the modern sense of the word, maybe these are not the best sex scenes, particularly not the scene of sexual abuse, which I deplore. Chapterhouse, the Bene Gesserit home planet, is being terraformed to create a new home for the sandworms. Bella, Duncan Idaho's previously Honored Matre lover, is undergoing the spice agony. He's worried she's not going to survive it. Their relationship's a bit of an emotional heart. She does survive it, seeks to merge the Honored Matre and the Bene Gesserit. They again escape at the end on another spaceship with some sandworms. Bit of a parallel with the end of the previous book. Then Frank Herbert dies, never finishes the book, so we never get to see what happens. His son, Brian Herbert, and his co-writer, Kevin Anderson, who've written many, many Dune prequels, wrote two books in the noughties around 2006.
Brian Herbert being the favoured of the two sons, right?
The favoured of the two sons, yes, the one who was who wasn't cast out for being gay, which we discussed in the previous video, which was again a very bad thing. This was the good son. He wrote what are widely known as the DUNE books because they're seen as a bit Dune light. I'll discuss those when I think there are good things about this book. My friend Matthew, my friend Matthew really liked them, and he sort of convinced me to like them. He said they're much more human, they're much more diverse, there's a lot more discussion. There isn't just Latover Second or Paul Atreides going on about how right they are the whole time. There's a lot more happening. From my perspective, I found them more boring than the first 4 books. The first 4 books, sometimes I thought they were super weird and really strange and sometimes wrong, but I was gripped. They had a clear plot. In these books, I felt like we slightly degenerated into endless discussions of politics, which I think brings us nicely onto the question that you raised, Simon, which is the question of fascism in Dune. I don't know if you want to say anything about that. I have things to say, but
well, only, I mean, 2 things really. I mean, listening to my knowledge of Dune as a story arc kind of ends with the transformation of Leto into a giant, horrible 3,500, 3,000 year old, I don't care really, hybrid sand maggot. Right, so that's where my kind of overarching knowledge ends, and really, like most people with a kind of passing interest in Dune, ends around Children of Dune, really. And it just struck me when you were talking through the arc of the story, and when we were talking about Frank Herbert and his, he's not backwards and coming forwards about having beliefs, and they sometimes seem quite esoteric. They're sometimes verging on the occult. Sometimes they are there's an eco side to it. There's a lot of Orientalism in his writing from the sounds of it. And this, what I would describe as a kind of proto-fascist ideology around House Atreides and the rightness of Paul and the kind of predestination element of him as the father of Leto. And the reason that's interesting to a certain extent, I mean, it's interesting anyway, and it depends. We're talking about a kind of very broad definition of fascism. But it connects specifically to what we will talk about with Warhammer 40,000 and Dune's influence on that. Because the early iteration of that game in 1987 is, and it's not even arguable, is a kind of satire on science fiction, really, I think.
It's really, that's interesting, because I think one of the things that I've really picked up in the debates around whether or not this series is proto-fascist, and again, like you say, whether something's fascist or autocratic is a fine line, which is being debated about many leaders in the world at the moment. When does autocracy become fascism? But certainly there's quite a bit of recent academic and critical thought which talks about how the alt-right has used science fiction and the Dune series particularly to justify its worldview and to justify fascism. It's become a bit of a locus for debates about fascism in science fiction. So I think there are arguments for and against it being fascist. I guess the argument for it, which you brought up, is that central to the plot of Dune and the plot of the first book is the idea that Paul Atreides is the Kwisatz Haderach, who is the culmination of the Bene Gesserit. The Bene Gesserit are breeders. They have been trying for millennia to breed a superhuman with more than superhuman powers. And there's a lot of debate in Dune about whether Paul is the Kwisatz Haderach or the Muad'Dib, as the Fremen call him, the prophesied leader, the One. And the idea that he has been genetically bred to be superior, and that Leto the second finishes what he cannot finish. I mean, just to give you one quote, one sample quote, there are many of these, but this is from Heretics of Dune as we're discussing that. Humans were not created equal. They possessed different inherited abilities and experienced different events in their lives. This produced people of different accomplishments and different worth. So the idea is that when people say that it's fascist, they say that it focuses on these messianic figures of Paul Atreides and Leto II, whose prescience, whose ability to see the future, whose ability to see mankind's golden path, as it's called, make them uniquely qualified to rule. I should say he has been accused of eugenics. I'm not sure it's entirely eugenicist. I mean, eugenicism is the idea that different races have different physical characteristics which determine a lot of their mental abilities. This is a Darwinian breeding program, so it's slightly different. The Bene Gesserit are selectively breeding people to try to create this perfect leader.
It's true that those two ideas, of course, and that's a really important distinction to make, isn't it? Because actually eugenics is used erroneously in discussions of fascism, really. And certainly when we're talking about the kind of fantastic worlds in which lots of those worlds have genetic manipulation as part of the world building, it's really important to draw that distinction. I would add, just in at this point, that the other thing that's interesting about the first two books from a fascist perspective is that alongside this kind of golden arc and this kind of path to humanity's greatness is this sense that the current political system is stagnant.
It's an argument against feudalism. So he argues that instead of having these feudal houses that you have at the beginning, you want this one great leader. And I thought that, the recent TV series, Dune Prophecy, which is about the origins of the Bene Gesserit, 10,000 years, I think, before the Dune books. But I thought that Diane Adimojon and Alison Shapka, the showrunners, did an incredible job of completely twisting this. This is not what's in the book, but what they make that series be about is the idea that people in the Dune universe are trapped in this world in which leaders have inherited power. So you're going to have the power is going to go to the son or the daughter, and they're not going to be democratically elected. Given that we're in this system, we are going to do everything we can to make sure that the right people are born, so manipulate from behind the scenes. So and make sure that the right kings are born with the right qualities, because we're stuck in this this monarchical system. So I thought that was a really interesting and really clever twist on it. It's not there in the books, but it's super clever. What people say about these books, and I think if you analyze the text, which I have to some degree, though I did a pretty swift read. There's endless back and forth debate about whether power is a good idea or not, whether democratic institutions are weak, whether Leto is bad or good, whether the golden path is bad or good. They debate this endlessly, and I think you can argue both sides from the text, and I think both sides are in the text, and you can argue that effectively what Frank Herbert ultimately demonstrates in his series, particularly in the later books, is that you do not want a single totalitarian leader, and that this is really dangerous and results in giant sandworms and all that kind of thing. So you can argue both sides, and they're very detailed arguments. However, my overriding impression, and this isn't something which I think can be technically backed up, but when you read a book, you just get a sense of who the author is, especially if you read 6 really long books, you just get a sense of who they are.
Six really long books that are a polemic, that are a political polemic, because that is what you've described.
You get an impression of them.
An evolving worldview,
My overall impression was that Frank Herbert comes down on the side of Paul Atreides and Leto II, that they are the people he likes and that they are his mouthpieces. So in that sense, I would say that it is proto-fascist, but that's just my reading of it. There are competing and other readings.
I think the problem with analysing a lot of these things in that way is that we forget that writers are human beings whose thought processes evolve, and that the Dune books were written over a 20-year period, mid-60s,
yes, mid-60s to mid-80s, 20 years, yeah.
And that I also believe, and you as a writer, Jay, might have a thought on this, that also, you know, your writing can affect your political process. You can write yourself into thinking a certain way and write yourself out of that.
You can, and I think I think it's often said that the best writers have some theme which obsesses them and which they come back to again and again, and which they can't let go because they can't quite solve it. I feel that's maybe the case in Frank Herbert. And I think in Frank Herbert's defense, we have to say that he did say at one point, I think late in his life, that, I think this was after the trilogy, the bottom line of the Dune trilogy is beware of heroes. So that was, you know, that's what he said.
And I think that's an important thing to kind of take. And again, talking about, you know, we're not saying this is a specific fascist piece of fascist propaganda. We're saying that there are tropes in it that can be identified by fascists, and arguably, I think even more so, the kind of the neo-fascist parties and the kind of new right movement that kind of sit into kind of, you know, 4chan and
it's the strongman fantasy ultimately. It's the idea that this whole like fascist strongman, the idea that there's this big strong leader who is great, you know, that's
and we're not going to argue or win that argument or have that argument. We're not, in this particular broadcast, we're not coming down on either side of that. So
I think we can say to our listeners that we are not fascists and not anti-fascists. I think that's we can say I'm prepared to stick my neck out.
Very anti-fascist.
I'd say anti-fascist. Okay. I
suppose what we're saying is we're not trying to argue that Frank Herbert is. We're just kind of noting those things
and I think
how that affects interpretation of the books, actually, which we'll come to in a second. But you know, it's not Starship Troopers. You know, Robert A. Heinlein was a very notable far right science fiction writer.
Yeah,
he's whose ideas are satirized by Paul Verhoeven in the amazing film Starship Troopers, which literally is a satire of the source material.
That's really interesting. I say, if anyone is interested in this, I very much recommend that you watch the 2003 miniseries by John Harrison, Children of Dune. Maybe not the first 3 parts, which, although Simon's friend was in them, so worth watching for that.
He's not a friend. He's somebody I know. He's not a friend. I don't know him well.
Okay, but I thought in Children of Dune, James McAvoy, who can be a really fine actor, plays Leto II, and I think he does it brilliantly, absolutely brilliantly. Plays the young Leto II. He does it with real charisma and real weirdness. So at the same time, he takes you on the journey where you're for Leto II while showing how completely weird Leto II is. And I think it's actually a really brilliant performance, really worth watching.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to dive into that because I remember the kind of chat at the time was that actually it was really good. Prophecy of Dune, Dune Prophecy of Dune.
Dune Prophecy. That's
definitely on my head. Name drop. I do know. I know something that very well, so I have to watch that, and I haven't yet.
Great. Shall we move on and talk about some of the adaptations? I think we've done that. Yeah, I mean, I guess I guess maybe I should just say one word about, just because we're sort of overviewing the Dune series for people, about Leto II's golden path. Like one of the central ideas of Dune, in addition to whether strongman leaders are desirable, is this idea of the golden path. I have to say the golden path is much discussed. It can be briefly summarized as the idea that Leto II has to control humanity for their own good by restricting access to the spice for 3,500 years. But this is to show humanity that actually this is not a good thing, and that strong leaders are not a good thing, and encourage the scattering, which will make humanity stronger for its own good. it's not very compelling. Like, even as I say it, it's not very compelling.
Yeah.
I really struggled, with pinning down what it is. It's a muddled idea, but there is deep thinking behind it, clearly. And
Yeah.
I will leave it at that, I think.
Well, I think that's a good part, point of jump off point to talk about the film adaptations.
Yes.
And the reason, if I might just kick off with that, which is that I like very much the Denis Villeneuve, the recent two films. And I think I watched them with my now 13-year-old oldest son. He loved them. Very exciting. And yet, I think they are a bit workmanlike. I think they are incredible visually. I think they got some nice performances. But I think because they're made in the 21st century, they cost a lot of money. There's a lot of things riding on them. They feel like they've been hollowed out in terms of any political statement.
I think yes, they definitely focus on big visual set pieces. They do make a valiant attempt to push back against this idea that Paul Atreides is the Muad'Dib and the white savior of the Fremen, and that has
that's definitely that's to do with casting and lots of things.
Yeah, but it's also in the text. Like there's this plot thing whereby Chani and the younger Fremen from the north are very much against the idea of Paul being this Muad'Dib, being this divine leader. Yes. And the southern Fremen, who are described as fundamentalists in the film, in league with Jessica Atreides, are pushing this idea of Paul as the savior, as the Kwisatz Haderach, and that Jessica tells Paul to take the spice to become the Kwisatz Haderach, which she doesn't do in the book. He does it of his own free will. So they did do some work in the script to push back against this strong idea.
Foregrounded. And I think that's a good point to talk about. I mean, I'm not saying for a second that Lynch's film is political, but by gosh, it's got a strong flavour, which we'll talk about in a second. We should just probably do a quick summary about the Jodorowsky aborted film.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Well, I mean, you and I have both done a little bit of research on that. There's a documentary that I've not seen.
Yeah.
I've been trying to track it down. It's not that easy to get hold of. Called Jodorowsky's Dune, which was a documentary in 2013 that was nominated for an Oscar about this project. So I
just summarise the project. So it was Jodorowsky tried in the mid-70s to make an adaptation of Dune, which would have been about 10 hours long on the first book, very psychedelic.
10 to 14 hours.
10 to 14 hours. And it failed. He couldn't get funding for it. It was too big. So that's the summit.
Yeah. Well, that's some of it. I mean, he was a kind of savant, really, Jodorowsky. He'd made these two crazy films, El Topo and The Holy Mountain, which are really kind of psychedelic, incredibly odd bits of cinema. And so on the one hand, he's exactly the right person, in the era of Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, studios handing money over to people. He's exactly the right person to make Dune, and also exactly the wrong person, right? So he has an idea. He approaches Salvador Dali to play the emperor. What's his name?
Emperor Shaddad. Yeah,
Shaddad, right?
Which would have been immense.
Well, but you know what Dali's condition was?
I think he wanted incredible amounts of money.
It was a huge amount of money. It was something like, I can find it now. Let me have a look. I pulled it up here.
Yeah. And Pink Floyd were going to do the soundtrack, weren't they?
There's an hour. Right, I'll do it. Give me $100,000 an hour. Yeah. And he went, yeah, all right, we're fine. We'll sort it out.
And then the film went over budget, and there's a lesson there, people. Yeah. Don't hire Salvador Dali or his ilk.
Absolutely. I mean, there's also kinds of interesting things. He planned to cast Orson Welles as Vladimir Harkonnen. He wanted his own 12-year-old Brontis, Jodorowsky, to play Paul. The music was not only Pink Floyd, but it would have been Magma. If you don't know who Magma are, anybody out there, Magma are what we used to call, I would call kosmischer rock, German 70s kind of Neu or Can, right? So that's interesting. And they actually got as far as doing kind of pre-production. And that's an important point, because one of the people who was involved in the conceptual art is H.R. Giger. who of course designed Alien. And one of the huge influences on Warhammer 40,000 is the art of H.R. Giger, right? And I don't know if you know that after that Jodorowsky adaptation fell apart, and before David Lynch was attached, Ridley Scott worked for it on 2 years.
Ridley Scott, who of course made Alien. And I should just say that
with H.R. Giger. So
I'm just saying for listeners who don't know, the reason we keep bringing up Warhammer 40,000 is that this is a role-playing game adaptation of Dune, effectively, or inspired by Dune.
It's neither of those things.
Actually. Okay, well, tell our listeners what it is.
We'll come to it. We'll get to it later. We'll get to it later.
Okay.
It's a tabletop game. It's the world's most famous tabletop miniature game, and it's not an adaptation of Dune at all.
Okay.
But if we're talking about the influence of Dune, and again, the seed for this was in our pre-discussion about this, in which you said that Dune is the best-selling science fiction novel of all time, and I was like, really? And you're like, yeah. I guess what I'm trying to argue is that its kind of influence is gigantic. So you've already got, you've got Jodorowsky, you've got H.R. Giger, you've got Ridley Scott, Blade Runner and Alien. Then you've got David Lynch, who in 1984 is asked to make the film by Dino De Laurentiis, who's got the rights at this stage, and makes Dune. And that was the first David Lynch film that I ever saw. And I was not very old when I saw it. And I did not know what to make of it. I mean, I am a huge fan of David Lynch. And my real gateway was much later, which was Twin Peaks in the early 90s. But I would have seen Dune maybe in 1988 when I was 12. And I remember how baffled I was by it. It was a huge flop. Nearly killed Lynch's career. It is not, I've seen it 4 or 5 times. It is not in anybody's book a good film, but it's a really interesting film. We've talked about how there's he really amps up the sexual violence in it. There's a very problematic scene around Baron Harkonnen that we discussed in the previous episode.
Yeah, we talked about, just to flag that we've talked about how it has been accused of being one of the most homophobic films ever made, and the portrayal of Baron Harkonnen is generally very homophobic, but we talked about that in our previous video, so we're not going to go into it again.
But the visuals in it are
visuals
really
are extraordinary.
striking.
I felt like it was kind of, for me, the film did 3 things. One was that it created some incredible visual images around the Dune universe, some of which haven't been picked up subsequently, which is surprising. The Space Guild's navigators, these mollusk-like creatures floating in their tanks, which we haven't seen in the Villeneuve adaptations. They were in the John Harrison adaptations, but he invented that. He invented the idea that the mentats eat the safu juice and have these red lips, so you can tell visually who a mentat is. He invented the weirding module, the particular Atreides way of fighting, which isn't in the books and hasn't been.
I didn't know that. I didn't know a Lynch thing.
So there's that weirdness, and with the Harkonnens, he really leans into the filth of the depravity, the vampirism, the sadomasochism, all the tropes there. And at the same time, he invents some images, like his image of the Dune sandworms has them coming across the desert with orange lightning playing around them, which is so striking that I can't believe nobody else has picked up on that, because worms with lightning around them are so cool. But at the same time, there are clunky elements to it. Some of it is just a bit like, it's a bit Star Warsy. It's a bit, a 70s film about space with people running around in their 70s looking costumes and their funny little pointy plastic guns. So there are elements of that, but I found it a really compelling film. And I think I did the first time I watched it as well, not knowing much about it.
I think is the score by Jean-Michel Jarre. I can't remember who the score's by. It's somebody.
Jean-Michel Jarre sounds a bit late, but maybe it's not.
Well, the film's 84, so
it could be, yeah.
It could be.
Check online.
I don't know.
Check online. I mean, I thought it was. I think it's very compelling. It creates some really compelling images, and it just leans into the weirdness. It enjoys the weirdness. It's got that. But do you remember? Did you ever watch Barbarella? It's got that sort of...
I've not seen it since I was very small, but yeah, I know.
That sort of crazy 70s Barbarella feel where everyone's just in...
Well, I think it's got that Roger Corman film, because I think Lynch is playing. I mean, Lynch is not, you know, he's a master of the weird, right? You only have to watch anything by him that isn't a straight story, but I don't think he's a straight up science fiction dude. And I know that Dino De Laurentiis, they were hoping that this would be Star Wars. You know, there was a 3-film arc planned, apparently.
Really?
That was sold to some of the actors.
And it didn't get made. That's interesting, because actually at the beginning of the Lynch film, there's quite a lot of planet business. There's quite a lot of, like, you know, them moving planets in 3Ds on screens and going, this is Goody Prime and this is Arakis, and, you know, and it starts off quite spacey and planety, and more so than the Villeneuve films, actually, and then that sort of fades a bit.
I think so. I think that there's definitely that kind of setup in the Lynch film. Now, interesting that you mentioned, we're going to talk about video games briefly, and then we'll just finish by talking about Warhammer. Talk
about Warhammer 40k, because I want to understand it. I've played Old World Warhammer.
Well, let me do the video game bit first, because it's going to pick up on. So it'll pick up on, or there's a thread running through this, is that one, you said that nobody done anything with the imagery. And actually, that's not entirely true, because there are a number of Dune video games, but the first one that was released that made any impact was released in 1992. It's called Dune, and I am the right age. I'm a complete nerd. I still play video games now. I spent a lot of time as a teenager playing video games, and because I was into science fiction, I was into David Lynch. Of course, I bought the game. And the interesting thing about that game, it cost a lot of money. It was nearly cancelled because of budget. So there's a reoccurring theme that's running through all of Dune adaptations around money and cost, ballooning cost. And they actually use the art from the David Lynch film, which is interesting.
Amazing.
Yeah. So the front cover is from the film. So this is 92. This is nearly 10 years after the film is released and tanked. So it's odd that the art is lifted from that. And then the still images, because it's a combination of a role-playing game and a strategy game, the still images, the story images are digitally recreated pictures of people like Carl McLaughlin as Paul Atreides. And the art is very, very heavily inspired by the kind of production design of Dune. At the same time that this was going over budget, it was nearly cancelled. Another studio called Westgate. Do I mean Westgate? No, I don't. I mean Westwood Studios, who were a very important games developer in the 90s. They developed things like Eye of the Beholder very famously, which is a big D&D game. They were working on a rival Dune game because Virgin, who owned both studios, were going to release both, thought that the first one wasn't going to get released. So they sent these other people off going, right, make your Dune game now. That game was released shortly after the first one. The developers, Westwood, were horrified that they were called Dune 2 because they got nothing to do with the first game. But that game, the mechanics of that game went on to be incredibly influential in video game design for the next 10, 15 years, because the Command and Conquer games that came afterwards that were developed by Westwood are modeled on the kind of strategy elements of that game Dune 2. So if we're talking about the influence of Dune culturally, even within video games, weirdly, you've got this kind of weird stunted offshoot that uses the David Lynch, the failure, and then you've got this much more kind of prosaic game that ends up being hugely, hugely influential because of the way in which it steers a certain type of video game. So enough about video games. We should finish up by talking about Warhammer 40,000. So Warhammer 40,000 is the most famous tabletop miniature-based war game in the world.
So when you say it's not a role-playing game, Simon, how is that different? How is that different from? Is that the people with the models that we see when we go to the game?
Yeah, well, it's a war game. Yeah. You have an army. There's an army. You fight. There are role. I mean, again, we haven't got. I could talk to you about how, specifically.
Yeah, honestly, tell me the difference between role-playing games and miniature tabletop.
There's no role-playing. There's no.
Okay, that's because when I see them there in the gaming cafe, they're just fighting with their big
I mean, that's a conversation for a different time. There is a crossover. Games Workshop are the most, they're the most successful company in the world who do this. And the reason that those game systems developed is that they were making these miniatures. They had a kind of another company called Citadel Miniatures. We should do a whole thing on this. Citadel Miniatures.
We should. Let us know if you want us to do that.
Let's do that. Effectively went, look, we could, if we did a board game, we could give the board game away for free, right? And then people would buy the miniatures. Because whilst people do use miniatures to play D&D, you're only using a couple of them, and you're not going to change them very often. Whereas the revenue that you need to carry on making miniatures requires people to carry on buying them, right? So that's the backstory. They publish a game called Warhammer Fantasy Battle, which is successful. And then in 1987, Rick Priestley, who's a game designer at Games Workshop, is approached to do a kind of science fiction version of a fantasy battle game. And the first edition does have role-playing elements in it, a little bit. We haven't got time to go into that now. But basically, he comes up with this concept of the universe, the world building, the game setting for Warhammer 40,000.
Well, what way is that universe based on Dune?
So, in the 40th millennium, the Imperium of Man is ruled by a god emperor who is entombed in a golden throne, because 10,000 years before that, he was mortally wounded in battle with his genetically engineered son, Horus. And the entire kind of universe in that first edition is stagnant. And explicitly, I would say, in the first editionals, this is not the case 10 editions later, nearly 40 years later, where people are selling these games to 12-year-olds, right? It is a satire of fascism. And if you are playing on the Imperium of Man, you are supporting a kind of authoritarian, fascist, xenophobic, technocrat-led vision of humanity.
Interesting. That sounds quite
humanity as Godhead, right?
That sounds quite Michael Moorcock Grand Bretagne style.
There's definitely this. I mean, look, it's a mashup. Nobody's ever going to say that Warhammer is the most 40k is the most original setting, but I mean, I've made a list of crossovers. So you've got the way in which you travel in space in Warhammer 40,000, which is through warp space, and in order to warp space, which is the fold of time and space. The way you do that is with a navigator, right? Same as in Dune. Instead of being powered by spice, they are powered by the Astronomicon, which is the beacon that the Golden Throne gives out, and they are psychers, effectively witches, which connects to the Bene Gesserit. The idea that the Emperor, the Imperium's kind of frontline fighting forces are these space marines, the Adeptus Astartes, who are organized into chapters, each with a very distinctive personality, uniform, history, which aligns, of course, with the houses in Dune. You've got the Emperor's bodyguards, Sardaukar, who are represented by the Adeptus Custodes.
The Sardaukar, that's a
Sardaukar.
term lifted directly out of Dune. The Sardaukar.
No. What I mean is the Sardaukar are the equivalent of the Adeptus Custodes. You've got the fact that there's no AI in the Warhammer 40k universe because of the Iron, and of course the Butlerian Jihad is the reference in Dune to the fact that there's no AI, and Mentats.
No computers, computers in Dune, no thinking machines at all.
Yeah, so no computers in Warhammer 40,000. You've got the Bene Gesserit represented by arguably the Sisters of Silence, who are a kind of another arm of the Imperium and the Inquisition. And yeah, it all kind of sits in this space.
Really interesting how it's made explicitly fascist, and the Latos.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, other people would say it isn't explicitly fascist. I would say it is. I would say that Rick Priestley absolutely knew what he was doing. He's satirizing science fiction. Look, and this is the era of, you know, Judge Dredd and 2000 AD. And it's also a satire on Thatcher's Britain to a certain extent as well. And I think certain bits on the left in the 80s believed that Thatcher was a proto-fascist. So it very much sits in that British science fiction space that is also occupied by 2000 AD.
Interesting.
And of course, grimdark, which is now a genre in itself, a huge genre in fiction and marketing, originates in Warhammer 40k.
Really interesting. So do we like it? Do you like playing it? Is it a good game?
Is it a good game? It's a really complicated game. I like the setting. The setting is definitely watered down. It's become very much watered down 40 years later. But the kind of connection to Dune really is huge. That there's so many references that are lifted, so much of Frank Herbert's kind of dystopian vision of the future. Because actually, you know, his vision is dystopian of the far future. And certainly Rick Priestley's idea of what will humanity be like in 40,000 years is not great. It should be mentioned that the God Emperor, who's in the Golden Throne, which is the Golden Path, explicitly has been guiding humanity because he knows what is best for it.
Yeah, well, that's very late the second to come back, and it's strange. I mean, one of the things that is strange to me in the Dune universe is in the Frank Herbert books is how little humanity changes. I mean, even in the last two books, Heretics and Chapterhouse, people have conversations about how there are people in the streets on which you can see on their face the genetic markers that they come of the Atreides line, that they look like Jessica or Paul. And this is 5,000 years afterwards. I mean, if you think how much people evolve in 5,000 years, the idea that you could recognize someone's face, I mean, it's mad, but it's a very static, very strange universe.
And that's certainly the kind of world building in 40k into the satire, is that's the kind of point that humanity has stagnated. It should be said as well, just while we're on that actually the joke about people who play Warhammer 40,000 being teenage lads with no interest, no social skills, which is the joke that was made in the 90s. You know, that's not true. But it is a strangely sexless universe, and it is a very, very Caucasian universe.
There is the Bene Gesserit, or their iteration, they're not as strong in the plot as in the Dune universe.
No, they're a real no.
Okay, well, we've been going on for nearly an hour, so do you think we should wrap up? I don't want to cut you off though, because I know this is your stuff that you know a lot about, so I'm happy to carry on.
Well, no, I think that's it. I think it's just in terms of the grand sweepers. What we're saying is that, you know, you started by saying that Dune's the best-selling book of all time, and I went, wow, is it really? And then most people haven't read it. Most people haven't read it, and yet I think we're trying to establish that without Dune, it tendrils are everywhere, from Ridley Scott, H.R. Geiger, Warhammer 40,000, video game design. And the landscape of modern science fiction would look very different without its existence. Yeah,
it's interesting. Even though it's not the most science fiction-y book, really, it's more of a science fiction fantasy book. It's not very space travel based. It's not very alien civilization based. Most of the science in it is about genetics. And even though there are a lot of references to Paul and Leto acquiring the ability to see the future and manipulate time. It's not really about time travel or time manipulation. It's mainly about genetics. It's interesting. Maybe it's got some roots in Brave New World. We'll maybe look at that in another episode. But anyway, I think are we okay to wrap up? And I think next episode I'm going to unilaterally decide, although we have discussed it, we are going to talk about William Gibson's classic 80s sci-fi, much more hardcore sci-fi quartet, his sprawl trilogy / quartet, known as the Neuromancer trilogy as well. So see us back as soon as we can get round to doing that.
Thanks, Jay.
Thanks, Simon. Great to speak to you.
Bye.
Bye.